Yeah, no, I'm trying not to move the...
Okay, ready? Right, the defence of the King and Queen is quite simple, really, and I'll summarise when I finish. Okay, so we'll start with the second floor, and this is taking evidence from the witness statements that have been given, and also the book of the incident book, which was taken from the incident board. Now, I'd like to point out firstly that several members of the team reported like an uncomfortable feeling, and as much as this is possibly uncomfortable, but we just can't measure it. You can't measure uncomfortableness, and you can't video evidence it in any way. So I'm sorry, but evidence that suggests someone feeling uncomfortable is not, as I could describe, as paranormal evidence. So I'd ask you to discount that as members of the jury. We'd move on to the auto writing, and again, although it's a fascinating experiment, again, how can we possibly evidence this? And the trouble is with this is that, I don't believe for 1 minute that any members of the team were pushing this around of their own accord. But, we cannot discount suggestion, subconsciousness, etc. It's not something we can measure. And because we can't measure it, I'm not able to be in a place where I can allow this to go as evidence. So I'd have to say to you, again, as the members of the jury, I'd ask you to discount this as evidence. There's another thing where we're talking about lights going on and off, and now unfortunately we're not talking about the main lights in the room going on and off, we're talking about audio lights going on and off, and I have a set of audio lights here that as you can see are sensitive to when I speak, etc. And they kind of go on and off with audio. Now, as much as I would suggest that this is good evidence when there's no noise, what we can't discount is that when it's in a place with high extremes of white noise, which is constant noise, human ears discount things that happen all the time. So I suggest that the very nature of the noise in the King and Queen could possibly be noises like traffic, etc., which the paranormal investigator had constantly heard, but their brain is just cut off, and consequently the lights will continually hear it and flash. Another thing that was mentioned was footsteps behind me. Fascinating evidence, I'm sure, but again, I've got no evidence in terms of hard evidence around audio recordings or video evidence of this. With the acoustics of the very nature of the place would suggest that it is possible that you could walk down and the acoustics of the group walking through could create the sounds of acoustics, walking behind you, etc. One thing that was quite interesting is that 3 members of the group reported the sighting of a silhouette behind a glass screen. Fascinating. I'd love to have caught that on some kind of more harder evidence in terms of video evidence or of some kind, but unfortunately it wasn't caught. So therefore we're just left with the hearsay evidence of the group. And as solid as it is that we have 3 separate witness accounts of this, again, I'd say as defence of the King and Queen, there is no evidence. There is no evidence. We only have a witness suggesting that this is what they had. Moving on to the toilets area, dowsing rods is a fascinating experiment, but unfortunately, as with the auto writing, etc., we cannot we cannot say it's evidence, in my view, because it can be manipulated in some way. And I'm not suggesting that it was manipulated on purpose, but it could be subconsciously manipulated. And what we're trying to look for is evidence of paranormal activity, and not what possibly could have been subconscious. The name Thomas Blaney also came up, but unfortunately, we talked about Thomas Blaney as one of our suspects for the haunting in the brief, and because it came up so quickly, I suggest that possibly this was suggestion rather than fact. Another piece that I looked at was that 2 members of one group suggested that they'd come up with the sensation of a female of plus 30 years old. I'm not quite sure how they come up with this, but this is what they reported in their reports. It's in the ladies' loos. Now, the suggestion is a female in the ladies' loos. Well, that's it's like having a drunk in a pub, isn't it? Or a betting man in the bookies. Going on a bit further than that, the sound of the camera shutting down, which was written in the incident book. When we went back to investigate this, I remember this. The camera had actually shut down. We went back to find out why the camera wasn't working, and we found out that the battery, in fact, had shut down. So that sound that they heard, I would suggest, was actually, in fact, the camera shutting down, and not anything paranormal. There was the shouting woman they heard. Now, in the King and Queen, let's not forget, this is the middle of Brighton, and You know, we don't know the acoustics from the outside areas, etc. It's the middle of the night. It's one of those nights where people have been out drinking, etc., or making lots of noise. Now, I suggest that perhaps that sound could have come from a neighbouring street and sounded like it came within the corridor simply because of the acoustics. Another piece of evidence was the 2-degree temperature drop which happened. One thing we did actually notice that there was a window open down that end of the corridor, so I would have to say that this again is not evidence. This would have to be discounted simply on the basis that that end of the corridor has moving air, whereas the other end doesn't, and consequently you've got moving air. I'm sorry, but that could be the reason for the temperature drop. As we move on to the basement, in the basement we had, you know, most of the group reported there was absolutely no sensation whatsoever, apart from there was a report of the camera which had fallen down, and the cable had fallen out of it and whipped back. I suggest this is all that had happened, is the camera had simply fallen off from where it was placed. As it had gone to the floor, the wire wasn't long enough, and consequently it pulled the wire, which pinged it back across, which gave a distance, and it looked like the camera had moved substantially from where it was placed. So, in the defence of the King and Queen, I would suggest to you that it's very serious that you consider the defence after hearing the evidence before you sum up as to whether or not the King and Queen is guilty or not guilty of being haunted.